tape begins at 41 minutes past 2 in the morning, local time at Vostok Station on the 8th of July, 1983. The camera is a Krasnogorsk 16mm mounted on a wooden tripod outside the drill shed, and the man who switched it on, senior mechanic Anatoly Feodorovich Gribin, according to the label taped to the real canister, has already stepped back out of frame. What the lens sees first is not the sky. It sees the shed, a low, wind-scoured plywood structure lit from within by a single sodium bulb. The door cracked open, a thin bar of yellow light spilling out onto snow that is not white, but faintly, unmistakably blue. Then the camera tilts up. There are 5 of them, 5 pale blue lights, hanging perhaps 40 meters above the roofline, arranged in a slow, deliberate ring. They do not flicker, they do not drift on the wind, and the wind that night, according to the meteorological log kept in a separate hand at the main hut, was running at 19 meters per second out of the southeast. Nothing at 40 meters above Vostok should be motionless in a wind like that. These are. They hold their circle, and the circle turns, once every 11 or 12 seconds, the way the minute hand of a clock turns if you watch it long enough to be sure. Each light is roughly the size of a man's fist held at arm's length. Each is the color of a gas flame that has burned too clean, that particular cold blue that has no yellow in it at all. Watch the footage carefully and you will notice something the men on the ground could not have known while they stood there. The lights are not simply glowing, they are pulsing, very slightly. A swell and a fade, a swell and a fade, on a rhythm slower than a resting heartbeat, about 44 beats per minute. I have counted them across 3 separate viewings of the surviving print held at the Arctic and Antarctic Research Institute in Saint Petersburg, catalogue reference AANI-16-007/83, and the rhythm does not vary. The camera stays on the ring for 2 minutes and 11 seconds. Then a voice off-frame, hoarse, Russian, unhurried, says only, "Come and look at this one." And the tripod is lifted, and the lens swings, and we are taken into the drill shed. Inside, on a low steel table under work lamps, there is a section of ice core about 70 centimeters long and roughly 15 centimeters in diameter. This is the tail end of a run brought up that afternoon from a depth the drill log records as 1,436 meters below the surface. Ice, by the accepted counts of the time, somewhere between 80 and 120,000 years old. The core is clear at its ends. It is not clear in the middle. In the middle, sealed inside a lens of refrozen meltwater the corers have not yet dared to cut, there is a shape. It is dark, not black, a deep, wet, brownish red, the color of old liver, the color of something that has kept its own moisture. It has lobes. That is the word the medic will use later in his diary, and it is the correct word. Lobes. 3 of them, clearly visible from this angle, folded against one another like the closed petals of some heavy underwater flower, or like the sections of a brain that has been removed intact from its skull. Along the seam between 2 of the lobes there is a paler line, almost cream, almost the color of cartilage. At one end of the mass, you cannot yet tell which end, there is a puckering, a small, drawn-in place, that in any other context you would call a mouth without hesitating. The whole thing is perhaps the size of a grapefruit. It sits in the meltwater lens as if it has been arranged there. And it is pulsing, very faintly. You have to steady the frame and look at the paler seam to catch it, but once you see it, you cannot unsee it. A slow swell along the length of the shape, a slow release, a swell, a release. 44 beats per minute, give or take, the same rhythm as the lights above the roof. The camera holds on it for a long time. Nearly 4 minutes of unbroken footage, which for 16mm film is an expensive and deliberate act. Someone wanted this recorded, and in those 4 minutes, across the whole soundtrack of the drill shed, the hum of the lamps, the settling of the building against the wind, the distant generator, You do not hear a single human voice. 6 men are in that shed. The station roster for that shift, cross-referenced against the medical log, gives their names: Gribin, Kovalenko, Popov, Zaitsev, the glaciologist Mikhail Ilyich Tarasov, and the young medic Vasiliev, who will begin his diary entry about this specimen only 11 hours later when his hands have stopped shaking enough to hold a pen. 6 men standing around a steel table watching a dark lobed thing breathe inside a block of ice that is older than their species. And none of them speaks, not one word, for 4 minutes. You can hear them breathing. You can hear boots shift on the plywood floor. At one point, this is at 3 minutes and 18 seconds into the interior footage, you can hear someone, I believe Kovalenko from the position, swallow, audibly, twice. That is all. The silence on that tape is not the silence of men who do not know what to say. It is the silence of men who have decided, without discussing it, that they will not say anything on the record. Then the camera tilts, very slightly, upward and to the left, toward the shed's small ventilation window, the one that faces south. And through that dirty pane of glass, blurred by frost, you can see, still hanging there, still turning, still keeping their slow blue heartbeat above the roof, the 5 lights. And on the table below them, the thing in the ice keeps time. This is the footage. This is where the story starts, in that 4-minute silence, with a specimen the Corers have just pulled from beneath 1.5 miles of Antarctic ice, and 5 lights above the shed pulsing in the same rhythm as whatever it is that is folded, dark and lobed and waiting in the meltwater lens on the steel table. Everything that follows, the earlier reels, the American huts, the Australian huts, the medic's diary, the men who walked out toward the lights and did not come back, everything follows from this reel, and from the question the 6 men in that shed had already, silently, agreed not to ask out loud. To understand how a specimen like this came to be standing on a plywood floor in July of 1983, watched in silence by 6 men who had agreed without speaking never to describe what they were seeing, you have to go back almost a quarter of a century to the first Soviet deep drilling seasons at what was then called Komsomolskaya, and to the ice cores brought up between the austral summers of 1959 and 1961 under the direction of the glaciologist Igor Zotikov and a young thermal drilling engineer whose name appears in the internal reports only as V.M. Petrov. Their bulletins from that period, deposited with the Arctic and Antarctic Research Institute in Leningrad and later microfilmed under call number AANII 4-113, use a phrase that will come back through the next 20 years of Antarctic paperwork like a slow bell. Anomalous inclusions. Anomalous inclusions at 612 meters. Anomalous inclusions at 704 meters. Anomalous inclusions, of organic character, unidentifiable, at 812 meters, retrieved on the night of February 14, 1961, and packed, according to the shipping manifest, in an insulated wooden crate marked simply Sample 4-A, destined for the Institute of Zoology on Universitetskaya embankment. Sample 4-A never arrived. The manifest shows it loaded at Mirny in April. The Leningrad receiving log for that year shows no entry under that number. There is a memorandum dated June 3, 1961, that refers, in passing, to a freezer incident at the receiving facility and to the reconstitution of certain inventories. That is the only trace. The core itself, the physical ice, is described in later summaries as lost to thermal event. Petrov, who had signed the extraction report, was reassigned that autumn to a hydrological survey in the Pamirs and does not appear again in Antarctic literature. And here is where it stops being a Soviet story. Because if you sit long enough in the film archives at Scott Base and the Australian Antarctic Division Library in Kingston, Tasmania, and you cross-reference the 16mm reels shot by the American winter overcruise at Bird Station and by the Australians at Wilkes and later at Casey against the extraction dates listed in the Soviet cadaster of anomalous inclusions, something begins to happen that no one has ever, to my knowledge, put in print. The nights match. Not approximately, exactly. On the American reel labelled Bird 12-C, filmed on the evening of August 2nd, 1962, a young meteorologist named Halloran walks his camera out into the polar night to record what he describes on the audio track as some kind of aurora phenomena, very localized, right over the mess hut. What you see when the film steadies is a ring of 5 pale blue lights turning slowly at an altitude he estimates at maybe 200 feet. The Soviet extraction log for that same night records the retrieval at Vostok of an anomalous inclusion at 743 meters. The Australian reel Wilkes 7-A, dated October 19, 1964, shows the same 5-light configuration above the generator shed at Wilkes. The Soviet log for October 19, 1964, records an inclusion at 802 meters. I have checked this correlation across 17 dated reels and 41 extraction entries between 1962 and 1971, and the coincidence rate does not fall below 83%. You can go look. The reels are catalogued. The extraction dates are declassified. Nobody has ever put the two lists side by side, which brings us to the medic. His name was Anatoly Sergeyevich Grinev. He was 34 years old in the winter of 1970, and he was the station physician at Vostok during the season in which an inclusion pulled from 968 meters was, for the first time in the written record, allowed to thaw under observation rather than being crated and shipped north, still frozen. His diary, 72 pages in a standard oilcloth notebook, was recovered by his widow after his death in Novosibirsk in 1994 and deposited, with some pages missing, at the Museum of the History of Science and Technology of Siberia. I have held photocopies of 48 of those pages. The relevant entries begin on June 11, 1970 and end on July 3rd. He writes on the 14th of June that the specimen is beginning to soften. He writes that its outer surface, which had appeared to him at first like a dark clump of algal matter, is separating into what he calls, and I am translating his exact word, chleni, segments or limbs. He writes on the 17th that he can now count 7 of them, arranged around a central mass, and that when the meltwater temperature crosses 2 degrees Celsius, the segments begin to move, slowly. Not, he insists, from thermal contraction, from within. On the 19th of June, he writes the sentence that everyone who has read the diary remembers, the sentence I cannot stop returning to. It is breathing. I do not know with what, and I do not know into what, but the central body swells and subsides on a cycle of approximately 11 seconds, and this cycle is identical to the cycle of the lights above the drilling shed, which I have now been watching from the infirmary window for 3 nights. Grinev's diary breaks off, or is broken off, on July 3rd. The next surviving page is dated July 19th and is written in a different hand, a note from the station commander that Dr. Grinev has been placed on medical rest and that the specimen has been recrated for shipment. Grinev himself was flown out that November. His personnel file at the Ministry of Health lists his rotation as terminated for nervous exhaustion. He never returned to Antarctica, and he never, according to his widow, spoke of what he had watched thaw on his examination table. And here I have to tell you about the men who walked, because they are the part of this story that the paperwork tries hardest to smooth over, and they are the part I cannot smooth over myself. Between 1962 and 1979, across the Soviet, American and Australian stations, on nights when the 5-light ring was recorded above a hut and an inclusion was being pulled from the ice below it, at least 11 men left their stations on foot in full polar dark, walking outward from their doors in the direction of the lights. I have their names. Vershinin at Vostok, August 4th, 1963. Petritis at Bird, September 2nd, 1965. The Australian radio operator Colin Marsh at Wilkes, June 11th, 1967, who unlatched the inner door of the accommodation block at 2 in the morning, walked past the generator shed without his outer parka and was found by a search party 90 metres from the station at first light, sitting upright, facing south, already dead. In every case, the official cause is one of 3 words: frostbite, exposure. Or, in the case of 2 of the Americans, the extraordinary phrase equipment loss, which in the ANARE and USARP incident vocabulary of that period is used for personnel who cannot be accounted for by the other 2. None of the 11 incident reports mentions the lights. None mentions that a core was being pulled that night. None mentions that the man had, in every recorded case, walked out without gloves, without goggles, without a lamp, in the specific direction of a phenomenon that the station's own camera was, at that same hour, filming above the roof. They walked toward it. That is what the reports do not say, and what the timing makes impossible to ignore. They walked toward the ring on the nights their colleagues were bringing something up from beneath it, and the ice took them, and the paperwork took the ice's side. And once you have sat with that timing long enough, the ring above, the core below, the man walking out between them, you begin to ask the only practical question left in this story. Where is the specimen now? Not the footage, not the diaries, the block itself, the dark lobed thing in its jacket of meltwater ice, catalogued, crated, sealed, weighed. If it existed, it exists somewhere, or it existed until a specific date on which it stopped. And this is where the record, which has been thin and evasive all along, becomes something stranger. It becomes bureaucratically busy. Suddenly, there are shipping manifests, transfer memoranda, customs stamps, freezer logs. There is a great deal of paperwork about the specimen in the years after 1968. It is only that none of the paperwork agrees with any of the other paperwork, and at the end of it, there is no specimen. The Soviet inclusions from the 1963 through 1966 seasons at Vostok were, according to the Arctic and Antarctic Research Institute's own internal transfer list, sent north in insulated crates aboard the Ob and the Estonia, offloaded at Leningrad and delivered to the Institute's cold storage facility on Beringa Street in the winter of 1967. The list gives crate numbers, mass in kilograms, and a column headed simply Sodozhimoe, contents, in which, for the anomalous cause, someone has written only Ledenoy blocks Vkluchenium, ice block with inclusion, and a specimen number. There are 9 such entries. In February 1969, the Beringa Street facility suffered what the subsequent Institute report calls an extended interruption of refrigeration, a compressor failure followed by a delayed response, followed by a partial thaw of the lower vault over what may have been as long as 60 hours. The report is careful. It lists the sediment cores lost, the biological samples lost, the ice cores lost by depth and station. The 9 anomalous inclusions are not on the loss list. They are also not on the surviving inventory taken 3 months later. They are, in the language of Soviet institutional accounting, neither present nor destroyed. They are simply no longer written down. The American specimens travelled a stranger road. Bird Station's 1966 and 1967 inclusion crates were, per the USARP logistics ledger held at the Center for Polar Archives, flown out on the seasonal LC-130 rotations to McMurdo, And from McMurdo, and this is the detail that stops you, rerouted through Christchurch, New Zealand, rather than sent directly onward to the receiving laboratory at the University of Wisconsin, which had processed every other American ice core of that season. The Christchurch stopover is logged as Customs and Quarantine Hold, a category that in 1967 did not, in ordinary practice, apply to sealed scientific ice at all. The crates sat in a bonded warehouse at Harewood for between 11 and 23 days, depending on which of two overlapping manifests you believe. When they left Christchurch, they left on a different aircraft, under a different consignment number, addressed to a facility in Maryland that appears in no other polar science correspondence of the period. Wisconsin's receiving log for that season has a line drawn through the expected entries and the marginal note in the hand of the receiving glaciologist, "Not delivered, consult NSF." The Australian material from Wilkes was, at least, honest about its fate. The two inclusion blocks from the 1967 season were, per the ANRA property register, reclassified as training samples and used in a thermal conductivity demonstration at the Kingston Laboratory in Tasmania in 1971, which is a polite way of saying they were allowed to melt in a controlled apparatus and the meltwater was poured out. So the specimens are gone by 3 different routes, in 3 different countries, on 3 different timetables, and no route ends in a jar on a shelf. A freezer that failed selectively. A quarantine hold that rerouted sealed ice through a warehouse in New Zealand. A training demonstration that dissolved the evidence into a drain. If you wanted to design an erasure that no single conspiracy could be accused of, this is what it would look like. It would look like ordinary institutional friction, applied 9 or 10 times in a row, always in the same direction. I owe the skeptics their hearing here, and I want to give it honestly because their case is not weak. The sober glaciological reading of everything I have described in this film is that the blue ring above the huts was atmospheric, ice crystal halos, refracted station lighting, or, most plausibly, the slow luminescence of methane and other trapped gases venting through pressure-fractured surface ice and ionizing in the very dry, very cold polar air. Vostok in particular sits over a basin known to contain biogenic gases at depth. Pull a deep core, disturb the column, and you can, in principle, release small pockets of gas that will glow faintly under the right electrical conditions in the boundary layer above the station. The lobed shape in the ice on this reading is a gas inclusion, a bubble deformed by pressure, coated in fine sediment, pulsing because the human eye at 40 below, in a crew that has not slept properly in weeks, on film stock pushed 2 stops in processing, will find a pulse in almost anything. The 11 men who walked out are, on this reading, cases of what polar medicine now calls T3 syndrome and hypoxic confusion. Well documented, tragically ordinary, and the ring they walked toward was in their own heads. I find parts of this persuasive. I find the methane argument genuinely strong for the lights. I find the T3 argument genuinely strong for at least some of the walkers. What I cannot make the skeptical case explain is the synchrony, the fact that the ring appeared on multiple continents, on the specific nights the inclusions were logged, and not on the hundreds of other winter nights when nothing was being pulled up. Coincidence will carry a great deal of weight in this field. It will not, I think, carry that. Which brings us to the last frame. The final piece of footage in the Vostok 1967 winter reel, catalogued at the AARI as V-67-W-114, is 19 seconds long and shows the drill shed interior at an unspecified hour of the polar night. The block is on the low table where the corers had left it. The camera is not moving. The block is half empty. There is a cavity in the ice, roughly the size and shape of what had been inside it, its inner surface smooth, almost polished, as though whatever had occupied it had left through a route the ice had made for it, rather than through any route a knife had made. There is no meltwater on the table. The wood is dry. Above the shed, on the exterior camera whose feed runs in parallel, The ring of 5 pale blue lights is already gone. The sky is only sky, only stars, only the ordinary black. No one is in the frame, no one speaks on the audio. The reel ends without a slate. And the question the reel leaves, the question I have not been able to put down in the 4 months I have spent inside this material, is not where the thing went. The question is smaller and worse than that. Looking at the cavity in the ice, its shape, its orientation, the faint asymmetry of its lobes, no one who has examined that frame, not the Soviet glaciologists in 1968, not the American reviewers who saw a copy in 1972, not the 3 specialists I have spoken to this year, has been able to say which way the thing inside had been facing when it left. You would think that a simple question. A lobed shape in a block of ice has a front and a back, a top and a bottom, an axis along which it was travelling when the glacier caught it. Even a jellyfish, even a scrap of tissue too degraded to name, has an orientation. The corers who pulled the inclusion up on the night of the 22nd of June had logged its orientation on the extraction sheet in the careful hand of the drill foreman Yevgeny Sominsky, whose signature appears on 11 other cores from that season, and whose handwriting the AARI archivists know as well as their own. Sominsky wrote, in the box for orientation, the word "verk," up, and drew a small arrow indicating the lobe he judged to be the leading edge. That sheet still exists. It is filed as V-67-W-114-A1 folio behind the reel itself. You can request it. I have held the photocopy. The cavity in the final frame does not match the arrow. It is not that the shape is reversed, which one could explain by a slow rotation in the melt. It is that the cavity has, in the ice, 2 smooth channels leading away from the main hollow. One toward the shed floor and one toward the shed roof, and the lobes of the void open onto both channels equally, as though the thing had gone in 2 directions at once, or as though the concept of a leading edge had, in the moments between the camera's frames, ceased to apply to it. The Soviet glaciologist Marat Yankelevich, who examined the block itself before it was cratered for Leningrad, wrote in his working notebook, the notebook that survived because his widow kept it in a kitchen drawer for 31 years before donating it to the Arctic and Antarctic Institute in 2003, a single sentence about the cavity. Ne imeyet perednego konca. It has no forward end. He underlined the sentence twice. He did not elaborate. He died in 1981 of an ordinary heart attack in an ordinary Leningrad apartment, and the notebook records nothing further about the specimen or the shed or the lights. I have tried, honestly, to make that sentence mean something conventional. A cavity with 2 exit channels could be the residue of 2 separate meltwater flows, one upward through convection and one downward through gravity, acting on an already vanished object. A cavity without a clear leading edge could simply be a cavity that has partially collapsed, its geometry smoothed by the last stages of melting into a shape that no longer preserves the specimen's original posture. These are reasonable readings. They are the readings the 1972 American reviewers reached for in the memorandum that accompanied their copy of the reel and which is now held at the National Archives in College Park under Record Group 401, Box 88, Folder 12, a document of 4 pages and remarkable dryness. Symmetric ablation cavity, they concluded. Original specimen orientation not recoverable from post-melt geometry. Recommend no further action. The memorandum is signed. The signatures are legible. The men who signed it are, as far as I can determine, all dead. And still the sentence sits there. It has no forward end. And still the ring sits there, over 5 stations, on the specific nights, in the reels that were never meant to be seen together, and which, when you place them side by side, show the same 5 pale blue lights hanging in the same slow rotation over sheds separated by 3,000 kilometers of ice. And still the men who walked out toward those lights sit there in the casualty rolls of 4 national programs, filed under frostbite, under exposure, under equipment loss, under the small administrative words that countries use when they do not want to write the larger ones. And still the crates sit there, or do not sit there, rerouted through Christchurch, lost in a Leningrad freezer failure that the maintenance log records as occurring on a night the maintenance staff were, according to their own time cards, not in the building. And still the medic's diary sits there in a private collection in Adelaide, describing a jointed thing breathing quietly on a steel tray under a red safe light, watched by a man who wrote the words, "I do not think it is looking at me, but I think it knows where I am," and then closed the notebook and went to bed and, in the morning, logged the shift as uneventful. Go back, if you can bear to the opening image. The drill shed at Vostok in the deep of the 1967 winter. The 5 pale blue lights in their slow ring above the roof, perfectly spaced, silent, casting no shadow the camera can find. The dark lobed shape in its block of meltwater on the low table below, pulsing faintly, in time with the lights, at a rhythm no instrument in the shed was calibrated to measure. The crew of 7 around the table, their breath showing in the cold, their voices absent from the tape, because at some point in the minutes before the camera began to roll, they had stopped speaking, and none of them, in the depositions taken afterward, could quite remember why. That is where this began. That is the moment the reel preserved for us, the moment a handful of men in a hut at the coldest inhabited place on Earth stood over something they had drawn up out of ice older than their civilization, and looked at it, and were looked at in return, or believed they were, which in that room, in that light, in that silence, amounts to the same thing. And the reel ends where it ends. The block half empty, the wood dry, the sky ordinary, the cavity with no forward end. The corers dispersed, some to other stations, some to other lives. One, Saminsky, to a quiet retirement in Petrozavodsk, where he refused, until his death in 1994, to discuss the winter of 1967 with anyone who asked, including his own son. The specimen gone, by a route the ice made for it, or by a route the paperwork made for it, or by a route we do not yet have a word for. The lights gone, the question left, not where it went, not what it was. Not why the ring appeared over 5 sheds on 5 nights across 2 decades and 3 continents, and then, after 1979, appeared no more, as though whatever had been signalling had received whatever answer it needed. The question is the smaller one, the one Yankelevich underlined twice in a notebook his widow kept in a kitchen drawer, the one no specialist in 58 years has been able to answer from the geometry of a cavity in a block of ice on a table in a shed at the bottom of the world. Which way was it facing?